Good afternoon and welcome to JWI's second annual Virtual Impact Summit. My name is Meredith Jacobs and I am honored to be JWI CEO. Last year, when the pandemic made it unsafe for us all to gather in person for Women to Watch, our annual celebration of Jewish women's leadership, we decided to create a virtual event that celebrated our communal impact on the world and raised awareness of our efforts to build a world in which all women and girls may thrive. Now, even though we hope you will all join us this March in Washington, D.C. for our in person Women's Leadership Conference, Advocacy Day on Capitol Hill, and the 20th celebration of Women to Watch, we still wanted to have an opportunity to hear directly from the voices of those who work day to day on critical issues that impact women and girls, preventing violence, supporting survivors, addressing systemic barriers to financial equality, and promoting women's leadership. So I thank you all for spending this afternoon with us, and I thank you for your interest, care, and support of our work on behalf of all women and girls. And I hope you'll stay all afternoon and join us at the end to light the Hanukkah and Shabbat candles. And then, if you're able, to join us on Zoom for a live Hanukkah party with women from around the country. Now, let's get started. Part of JWI's comprehensive approach to ending violence against women and girls is our work at both state and federal levels advocating for legislation that supports and protects survivors. I am honored now to be joined by two powerful leaders who I'm honored to call partners and who are truly champions for all women and girls. Congresswoman Kathy Manning represents North Carolina's 6th Congressional District. In Congress, Representative Manning is a proud member of the Education and Labor and Foreign Affairs Committees. In North Carolina, she's a strong advocate for affordable health care and prescription drug prices, a quality education for every student, economic opportunity, and equal justice for all. And by the way, she's also a former JWI Woman to Watch honoree. Representative Manning, welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. As you mentioned, I have a long history with JWI, so I'm delighted to be back here with you today.
Thank you. We're also going to be joined by Senator Cheryl Kagan, who represents Rockville and Gaithersburg in the Maryland State General Assembly. A member of the House of Delegates from 1995 to 2003, she returned to the nonprofit sector until 2014 when she was elected to the Maryland Senate. She was elevated to Vice Chair of Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee in 2019. Senator Kagan, welcome.
It's great to be with you, Meredith. Congratulations and thank you for all that you do. I'm proud to call you a friend and a constituent.
Thank you. Me right back at you. So this past year, JWI conducted a needs assessment, which surveyed domestic violence service providers regarding the needs of survivors in the Jewish community. And we heard from them that some of the top needs of survivors are, and I'm sure you both know this, access to resources to provide them with economic security, since they may have poor credit or no credit, as well as intermittent employment histories due to financial abuse, access to affordable housing, and however, there may be additional barriers to survivors securing housing, including discrimination from landlords as a result of the crimes committed against them, access to culturally specific services that are provided by faith-based programs due to their unique religious and cultural needs. So my first question to both of you is, how is the legislative work that you're doing filling these gaps and creating systemic change and services available to survivors? Representative Manning, why don't we start with you?
Great, and thank you for that important question. I am thrilled that the House of Representatives recently passed the Family Violence Prevention and Services and Improvements Act, which we call FIPSA, a bill that came through the House Committee on Education and Labor, which I'm proud to serve on. And FIPSA was the first federal law to provide resources for survivors of domestic violence it was first introduced almost 40 years ago, and yet FIPSA is still the primary source of federal funding for domestic violence shelters in this country. It was most recently authorized in 2010, but it expired in 2015, leaving vital programs like crisis counseling and safety planning underfunded and outdated. And as we know, intimate partner violence rates have surged during the COVID-19 pandemic. They put a real strain on services that survivors urgently need, and survivors are at risk in a time of heightened economic, health, familial, and emotional trauma. And so now more than ever, the services that FIPSA provides, like National Domestic Violence Hotline, the emergency shelters, and culturally specific programs to meet the needs of victims from racial and ethnic minority populations as they seek services and protections from abuse. All of those things are vital. And so voting to reauthorize FIPSA was a vote to fill gaps in life-saving services for survivors and also to invest in prevention. And just as you mentioned, Meredith, it's essential that our efforts to support survivors serve all survivors, especially survivors from communities of color. And that's why I'm proud that FIPSA invests in culturally specific community-based organizations that are equipped to address challenges facing survivors from racial and ethnic minority populations as they seek support and protection from abuse.
Thank you so much. Did you find that there were you surprised at any of the challenges that you had with bipartisan support, anything that you faced in trying to get FIPSA either enhanced or reauthorized this year?
Meredith, nothing surprises me in this Congress, as you can only imagine. But fortunately, we have a majority of Democrats in the House of Representatives. And as long as we all stay together and really push for the issues that are so important to people all across the country, we will get these important pieces of legislation passed.
And it was interesting that you noticed the importance of having culturally specific, especially for communities of color, and the way violence impacts the women in those communities. This was also very much a part of our needs assessment when we were looking at the culturally specific needs of Jewish survivors. I remember we had a conversation with the head of a rather large secular DV group, and discussing the needs of housing needs for Jewish survivors. And she said, actually, we've never thought about Jewish survivors being marginalized and needing culturally specific. And as a result, they're now thinking of needs differently, as well as other religious groups are coming to us, other faith groups are saying, how can we do for our community? How can we have a similar needs assessment so that we can also bring more culturally specific work to our communities? Senator Kagan, can I turn to you? So much important work is being done on the state level. We know this. What are you looking at this year in the work to help support and protect survivors?
Thank you, Meredith. First, I just want to give a shout out to Congresswoman Manning and all of the courageous members of Congress, women and men who are fighting to do the right thing in these crazy times. So thank you for your leadership on behalf of women, of DV survivors, and on so many important issues. We are very lucky that you are in office. As is often described, state legislators are often the laboratory for Congress, and what is passed at the local level sometimes will kind of boil up and get noticed by Congress and then enacted on a federal level. Thanks to the leadership of JWI, my staff and I and some of my colleagues have been exploring the opportunity to provide economic support for DV survivors. So Maryland's laws used to be pretty far behind the times. We trailed in a lot of areas in terms of supporting these women and men, but we're finally sort of caught up. And now the hope is that we can kind of get ahead. And the idea is coming up with some opportunity to help these primarily women get a new lease on life. If they've left an abusive home, maybe with kids, and probably with a with, as you indicated earlier, either a destroyed or a non-existent credit rating? How does she get funding to find a car so that she can get to her new job, put a down payment on renting or buying a place for her and, again, maybe her kids? How can we encourage banks and credit unions to take a credit risk when there really might not be on paper the merit of doing so? So we're looking for a modest size revolving fund, or an insurance policy that if a bank provides funding for in such a situation, that we can provide a bit of a backstop in case there's a problem with repayment.
Thank you so much, also Senator Kagan, from taking our call when we said, how can we incentivize banks
Yes.
to take their chance and give loans and lift those hurdles that are preventing survivors from getting those loans that will really put them on the path to long-term economic stability. So we're
Yes.
excited. What else are you seeing will be the most significant issues, do you think, impacting women that can be addressed through legislation?
Well, I can just say that one of the challenges is going to be figuring out where the funding comes from and making sure that we get the banks and credit unions on board. They wanted to start off with a bit, forgive me, a bit patronizing of, we'll just give them a brochure. We'll just teach them about financial literacy as if it's, a situation they chose to be in. So I think there has to be education, not just of my colleagues, but of the advocates to make sure we get them on board. And your staff and mine have been working together so beautifully with other advocates to see what we can do and increase the size of our coalition. In terms of other legislation, I sponsored a GET bill a couple of years ago, and as folks know, too many women are agunot, chained women, because their husbands won't give them a Jewish divorce, which prevents them from getting remarried. There is often threats, whether that's financial or access to children, visitation, negotiation, stuff that really the women don't have a good stake in, enough clout to have things come out fairly. It's really a challenge. It's an important bill. Only New York has really strong legislation, and the sponsor of that has been my partner on this. It's really hard to navigate the church-state division and making sure that we can honor the First Amendment and separation of church and state while protecting women who are chained into a marriage that is over.
Interesting how complicated something that should be a no-brainer has.
Exactly.
Representative Manning, what's on your to-do list for women this year?
So this week of all weeks, when the Supreme Court is about to hear argument in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which we know is the Mississippi case, this is a case that could well mark the end of Roe versus Wade. So I think it's critically important that we talk about what's going on around the country with regard to taking away a person's freedom to decide how they want to handle their reproductive health care and their reproductive rights. We all know that anti-choice or anti-freedom to decide legislation is taking place in states all across the country, where conservative state legislatures are enacting medically unnecessary restrictions and, frankly, blatantly unconstitutional bans on abortion. And these bans go against 50 years of legal precedent. We have two generations of women who are alive today who have taken for granted, and now there's a third generation taken for granted that they will have the freedom to decide how they want to control their own reproductive lives, how they want to have children, with whom they want to have children, when they want to have children, and how they can best handle their own families. So we know that access to reproductive health care is under greater threat than ever. And I think it's important for us to recognize that this is a matter of taking away freedom, taking away control, and the consequences of these attacks on freedom will impact communities of color and poor communities, underserved communities, which already face barriers to healthcare. Reproductive freedom, reproductive decision-making cannot just be for the few. Access to reproductive health care must be equitable. It must be for every person seeking health care. And that's why I am so delighted that I was able to vote to support the Women's Health Protection Act, which I'm proud to say passed the House of Representatives. This is historic legislation that federalizes a healthcare professional's right to provide abortion care to their patients. It protects a person's ability and freedom to make decisions about their health care, including seeking access to an abortion. And we need the Senate to take action now before the Supreme Court. And of course, we have many questions about what this newly composed court will decide before they make a decision that would literally take away people's freedom to decide how they want to make the most intimate decisions, most important decisions in their life.
It is.
Amen.
Yeah,
Can I add one more thing, Meredith? Because
absolutely.
going along with this kind of healthcare, it's not just about the right to decide whether to have an abortion. It's also contraception access. You might think that conservative state legislators who are so concerned about preventing abortions would then be open to making contraceptive access available for everyone. Quite the contrary. Too many people in this country go without access to reproductive health care they need. They are shamed, they are judged, they are discriminated against for their decisions about pregnancy and parenting, and access to contraceptives is included in those problematic decisions. And that's why I'm an original co-sponsor of the Access Birth Control Act. And this is legislation that would prohibit pharmacists from refusing to fill prescriptions for birth control based on their own personal beliefs, not on legitimate medical or professional concerns. It's hard to believe that women are actually facing problems with pharmacists who are using their own religious proclivities to deny them contraception that has been prescribed by their medical providers, but that is in fact happening. So this Access Birth Control Act is a bill that would protect patients from being intimidated, threatened, harassed by pharmacy employees who personally object to the use of contraception. And we know that pharmacists have refused to fill prescriptions for birth control or to provide emergency contraception over the counter to individuals in 24 states and DC. 24 states and DC. These same pharmacists who refuse to dispense contraceptives because of their personal beliefs also often refuse to transfer a woman's prescription to another pharmacist or refuse her or refer her to another pharmacy. So just another attempt to humiliate and degrade people who are trying to manage their own health care.
And the folks who oppose women's reproductive choice, who have concerns or oppose birth control, are the same ones who aren't stepping up to provide support for families with unwanted, unplanned pregnancies and helping raise children in a happy, loving, safe, and flourishing household. They are not supporting funding for education or climate, protecting environments. So whether it's lead in the water or unsafe air or unsafe schools, guns everywhere. It's really, these are the same folks. And I just want to pivot. When you're talking about any of these issues, we also have to talk about voting rights. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill is critically important. We've got to make sure that all of these laws that are being passed around the country that deny American citizens the right to vote in a convenient, safe, accessible way is just extraordinary. And again, with some of these are not overturn these laws. And so when you're talking about judges being appointed, when you're talking about laws being passed, who is the executive, who is the legislative body making these decisions? We've got to make sure that folks have access to the vote and that they use their franchise and that they are informed and cast a ballot that reflects their priorities, their values, and their needs.
Thank you. And let's add to this parental leave, childcare, universal pre-K. I mean, you're
Yep.
talking about the supports. It is unbelievable that we are looking at really losing Roe. JWI will turn 125 in January, just next month. I have
Wow.
pictures of the women when we were B'nai B'rith women holding up the signs, marching for Roe. This was something, not that long ago. I never imagined we would lose, and it is horrifying what's happening now. So I want to ask you both, but let's start with Representative Manning. What actions can JWI's members do to create systemic change and influence legislation that impacts women and girls? We talked about voting. It's critical. That's like vote, 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 vote.
Job one. Job one. Yes.
What else?
Absolutely. And Senator Kagan, I want to thank you for raising the issue of the John Lewis Voting Right Act, because you could not be more on target. If we can't protect the right to vote, we are going to see more and more of these rights taken away. And thank you also for mentioning that not only are the people who want to deny access to health care exercising those opportunities all across the country. If you look at what we did, the bill we just passed, the Build Back Better Act that we passed in Congress last week, the people who vote against women's health care are also the people who voted against universal pre-K and child care and affordable housing and all the other things that we had voted to provide resources for. It's consistent in their vote to undermine people trying to control their families, their lives, and make a better life for their children. What actions can JWI's members take to create change? Well, civic engagement is something that JWI has always promoted. It's more important now than ever. People should make their voices heard to their elected officials, especially to your senators, because right now, so much of what's going on lies in the hands of the senators. And if we have people who are living in West Virginia, members in West Virginia, members in Arizona, I would urge those members to call Senators Manchin and Senators Sinema and talk to them about maybe a carve out in the filibuster so that we can get that Freedom to Vote Act passed and protect the voting right. As I mentioned, the House of Representatives has passed landmark legislation that would advance gender equity and social justice. I talked about the Women's Health Protection Act. We also passed a Paycheck Fairness Act. As Senator Kagan mentioned, we passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act along with the John Lewis Act. We also passed the Violence Against Women Act, critically important, and the Equality Act. So we need JWI's members to call on their senators to ask them to support women's health, safety, economic security, if they want to see change. I would also add one more thing to the list, because from my new perch as a representative, I can tell you one other thing that I pay attention to. That's letters to the editor. And we don't often talk about that. We talk about writing your representatives and calling them and meeting with them. I think letters to the editor are also effective. I can tell you, I read the ones that mention my name. And so write a letter to the editor and talk about what your senator and your representative should be doing. That has a lot of effect. We know that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Meredith.
Is the same for social media? So
that's where I was going to go. So Meredith,
are you paying attention to the tweets and the posts and the Instagram? Like, does that move the needle at all?
So that's actually where I was gonna add to what Congresswoman Manning so appropriately said. Social media, too many folks on sort of the good guy side think it's beneath them, or think it's too hard or too confusing or too time consuming. But I can tell you, the right wing and the anti-choice and the anti-healthcare and the anti-education folks, they're out there. And some of them are just awful. And they troll us and they tag us, and they are especially focused on women and women of color. I can tell you that, and I just have to give a shout out to my good friend, Eileen Filler-Corn, the first woman and the first Jewish speaker in Virginia, who did extraordinary things in Richmond over the last 2 years as speaker. And when Terry McAuliffe lost for governor, the House majority switched also. And so her leadership is going to be rolled back. And that is in part because of social media, because the haters, because they take something that is inaccurate and amplify it. And too many people see it. They don't do their homework, and they're either dispirited and don't vote, or they vote for someone who sounds nice or looks nice, looks like someone you want to drink a beer with or play basketball with. But I can tell you, you've got to focus on the issues. So social media is vitally important. I can say that if folks have a Facebook account, that's perfectly fine. But what I always say is with Facebook, you're talking to people who already know and love you. With Twitter, you're talking to the world. And if you do appropriate tags and write thoughtfully, you can get retweeted and get seen by a lot of people. And your elected officials need to know that you're out there and need to know what you care about. Do it in a respectful way, because if you tweet at me and you say Cheryl Kagan is an idiot and doesn't work on issues I care about, the chances of my wanting to have a conversation with you are kind of slim. But if it's thoughtful and respectful, there's going to be a different level of engagement and responsiveness. So I really encourage you, push yourself a little, get other friends and relatives to do the same. Find hashtags that are trending, that reflect your views, that'll get seen more often, and truly you can have an impact.
Well, thank you both, Senator Kagan, Congresswoman Manning. Thank you for joining us today, and really for your tireless work each and every day on behalf of all women and girls. I wish you and your families a very happy Hanukkah. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. Chag Sameach to all.
Thank
Great
you.
to be with you.
Thank you, Chag Sameach and Senator Kagan. I hope we get to meet in person sometime.
I would love that, Congresswoman. All the best to you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Next up is a conversation about JWI's bold new initiative, our National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence in the Jewish Community. Included as a vital part of the National Center is JWI's Clergy Task Force to End Domestic Abuse in the Jewish Community. This multi-denominational group of clergy offers trainings to help all Jewish clergy better understand domestic abuse, and it also builds resources so that our clergy feel better equipped to raise awareness of domestic abuse, as well as support survivors in their congregations and communities. One of our newest projects, and one that we are so excited about, is a series of discussion cards called Unboxed, Opening Conversations about Interpersonal Relationships. The first box, our Shabbat edition, will draw on Shabbat prayers, text, and tradition to prompt conversations with your family and friends. So throughout the summit, we're giving you a sneak peek at these conversation cards. You'll see on your screen some of the prompts, and we ask you to imagine that we are all at a virtual Shabbat table, and if you would, use the chat box to answer the prompts. We hope to have a lively conversation throughout the summit. So before we go into our next panel, here's our first prompt. By the way, while the boxes will be available for your organizations and homes in January, anyone who makes a donation today of $75 or more will receive one as our thank you gift as soon as they arrive at our offices. So enjoy, and I can't wait to take part in this conversation.